She didn't speak. She didn't smile. She didn't even look up. When Amara Wilson walked through the rusted gates of East Ridge High for the first time, she moved like a shadow, quiet, deliberate, unnoticed by most, but somehow deeply unsettling to those who did. There was something about her, something in the way she held herself, like a coiled spring wrapped in silence. No one knew her name yet, but within seconds, people were already whispering, not loud, just enough. "Who's that?" "She's new." Did you see the look in her eyes? What they didn't know was that Amara had seen this scene play out before. Too many times. New town, new school, new set of judging eyes. But the rules never changed, and neither did her goal. Blend in, stay low, graduate, and disappear. Simple. East Ridge wasn't special. It looked just like every other school she'd been forced to start over in. Gray walls, buzzing fluorescent lights, stale cafeteria smells, and students too busy maintaining their social standing to notice anything that wasn't trending. But even before her first class, Amara could feel it. That familiar shift in energy the moment someone like her walked into the wrong kind of space. She could feel the way eyes lingered a little too long on her dark skin, her braids, her calm. Not the loud kind of attention. Worse, the quiet kind. The kind that builds like smoke before a fire. The kind that says, "You don't belong." As she made her way down the corridor, clutching her transfer paperwork and schedule like armor, she passed groups that fell silent mid-conversation. She knew what they were thinking. They always thought the same thing. Too quiet, too serious, too different. Some of them smirked, others just stared. Amara didn't react. She had trained herself not to. After all, she'd made a promise to herself a long time ago. Never let them see what you're feeling. Not fear, not sadness, not rage, especially not rage. Because the last time she did, someone got hurt, and she had paid for it. Her footsteps echoed softly as she stopped at her locker, glancing at the number written on her paper. She turned the combination with steady fingers, keeping her head down. No distractions, no eye contact. But the second she opened her locker door, she knew she wasn't alone. There was a shift in the air behind her, a pause in the hallway noise, like something important was arriving, and without even turning, Amara could feel it. The real game was about to begin. They walked like they owned the ground they stepped on. Tessa Blake and her entourage didn't need to announce themselves. The school did it for them. The crowd parted, whispers flew, and every head turned. Tessa was tall, effortlessly stylish, and radiated the kind of confidence that could crush people without saying a word. She wasn't just popular, she was powerful. She decided who mattered and who didn't. And the moment she locked eyes on Amara, that power had found its new target. Tessa didn't speak right away. She just watched, calculating, her icy blue eyes scanning Amara like a threat disguised in plain clothes. Behind her, Kylie and Paige exchanged quick glances, then let out a little giggle, the kind that wasn't funny, but loud enough to sting. Tessa stepped closer, the faintest smirk playing on her lips, and said just loud enough to be heard, "Didn't know we were taking transfers from ghost towns." Kylie snorted. Paige covered her mouth like she was shocked. Amara didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She closed her locker, slung her bag over one shoulder, and walked past them without a word. That silence, it wasn't weakness. But they didn't know that yet. By third period, the whispers had taken root. She didn't even say anything. "I heard she got expelled from her last school. Bet she's hiding something." It wasn't the lies that bothered Amara. It was how fast they spread. She sat in the back of each class, head down, only speaking when absolutely necessary. Teachers didn't press her. Students kept their distance, except for Tessa and her group. They had made it a mission to dissect Amara's silence, and in their minds, silence wasn't strength, it was a challenge, and challenges were things Tessa Blake crushed. Lunch was the worst. Amara sat at the corner table near the vending machines, the one with the broken chair no one wanted. She liked it. It gave her a clear view of everything, especially them. Tessa's table sat dead center like a throne room, and she held court like a queen. Students laughed too loudly at her jokes, nodded too eagerly at her stories, but every few seconds Tessa's eyes drifted toward Amara, cold, curious, threatened. Amara pretended not to notice, but inside she felt it. The tension, the warning signs. This wasn't just teasing, it was a setup, and the moment was coming, fast. And then it happened. On day 4, Amara stepped into the cafeteria, tray in hand, ready for her usual routine. Back table, quick lunch, head down. But before she could even sit, Tessa was already moving. She walked past, stopped suddenly, and, accidentally, let her soda slip. It splashed across Amara's tray and shirt, loud enough to draw attention from every table nearby. Gasps, laughter, the slow rise of phone cameras, as if they were about to witness a meltdown. Tessa smiled sweetly, fake concern dripping from her voice. "Oh no, I'm so clumsy. Hope that didn't ruin your—" "Oh wait, do you even have clothes to ruin?" The laughter was immediate. Except Amara didn't laugh. She didn't yell. She didn't even look at the mess on her shirt. Instead, she stood, calmly, picked up her tray, walked to the trash can, dropped it in, then turned and walked right out of the cafeteria, her shoulders straight, her eyes forward, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than anything Tessa had expected. That silence spread, through the lunchroom, through the halls, and for the first time in years, Tessa Blake felt something she didn't understand, something she hadn't prepared for. Doubt. And Amara? She didn't look back, but she knew. The game had started, and they had no idea who they were playing with. The cafeteria was never just a place to eat at East Ridge High. It was the stage, the arena. The unwritten social rule book was on full display there every single day. Where you sat told people who you were, who you belonged to, who you feared, and who you'd never dare cross. That day, when Amara walked out without flinching, without giving Tessa the breakdown she wanted, something shifted in that hierarchy. Not for everyone, not immediately, but a spark had been lit. A question had been planted in people's minds, not just about Amara, but about Tessa. Because if the queen bee couldn't even make a new girl flinch, maybe she wasn't as powerful as everyone believed. The whispers started before the lunch bell even stopped ringing. "Did you see her face? She didn't even blink." Tessa looked kind of embarrassed, right? And though no one dared say it out loud, a quiet unease began creeping into the edges of Tessa's perfectly curated world. Her smile that afternoon was tighter, her laugh a little too forced. She kept glancing over her shoulder as if Amara might suddenly come back, not with words or fists, but with that same cold silence that had said more than anything else could. Amara, on the other hand, returned to class as if nothing had happened, sat in the same seat, hands folded, eyes forward, but inside her chest felt tight. Not from fear, not from regret, but from pressure, the kind that builds slowly, like steam in a sealed room. Her silence had worked for now, but she knew girls like Tessa didn't back off after one failed stunt. They escalated. They turned passive cruelty into public spectacle. And if history had taught Amara anything, it was that she had maybe a day, 2 at most, before the next round began. The next morning confirmed her suspicion. As she walked down the hallway, she noticed it right away. The extra stairs, the subtle smirks, the students conveniently stepping out of her path as if they didn't want to be too close when whatever came next happened. And then she saw it, her locker covered in sticky notes, dozens of them, all in different handwriting. Some were sarcastic jokes, others were straight-up insults. Mute freak. Who even are you? Go back to wherever you came from. Amara stood there unmoving, eyes scanning each message like she was reading a menu she had no appetite for. The hallway was silent, students pretending not to watch, but watching everything. She took a slow breath, peeled the notes off one by one, folded them neatly into her notebook, and continued on to class. Not a word, not a glance at anyone. And just like that, another attempt to shake her was turned into a quiet, controlled ritual. But the real storm came later that day, in gym. Gym class at East Ridge wasn't just about fitness, it was where reputations were built and broken, especially with students like Mason Blake on the field, Tessa's older brother and the school's golden boy, captain of the football team, beloved by teachers, feared by underclassmen, and most importantly, never far from his sister's drama. If Tessa wanted someone to send a message, Mason was her go-to. That day, Amara was assigned to Mason's team during a co-ed scrimmage, and the moment her name was called, he smirked, not in a friendly way, in the way predators do when they spot easy prey. "Try not to trip out there," he said loud enough for others to hear, earning a ripple of laughs. Amara didn't respond, just tied her shoes tighter. The game started rough. Every time Amara moved to get the ball, Mason just happened to be in the way. A shoulder bump here, an elbow nudge there, all subtle, all small enough to pass under the coach's radar, but deliberate, the kind of calculated physical harassment that only someone who enjoyed having power would know how to dish out. At one point, Amara went to make a simple pass, nothing fancy, and Mason barreled into her side, sending her stumbling onto the grass. Whistles didn't blow, coach didn't see. But the sidelines erupted. Some cheered, others whispered. A few girls winced. Tessa from the bleachers smiled. But Amara stood up without brushing herself off, without looking back at Mason, and went right back to the game like it never happened. After class, while everyone else hit the locker rooms, Amara sat alone at the far end of the bleachers, staring out across the field. Her breathing was steady, but inside, her mind raced. It wasn't just about what happened out there. It was about what might come next. If they thought a few bumps on a football field could scare her, they clearly didn't know who they were dealing with. But that didn't mean it didn't hurt. Not physically, emotionally. Because even though she didn't show it, even though she'd trained for years to stay calm, it was exhausting having to live like this. Like you're always 2 steps away from becoming someone you promised never to be again. That night, Amara didn't go straight to her room after dinner. Instead, she walked into the garage, where the familiar smell of sweat, dust, and leather greeted her like an old friend. Her father was there, as always, taping up the worn-down punching bag, checking his form in the mirror. Marcus Wilson wasn't just her dad. He was her coach, her compass, her anchor. When she stepped inside, he turned slowly, his eyes reading her like a book he'd read too many times before. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. She stood there for a second, then walked over and picked up her wraps, began tightening them around her knuckles. Her father didn't say anything right away, just nodded. Then, as she squared up to the bag, he spoke quietly. "You only come in here when the weight's getting heavy." Amara hit the bag once, sharp, precise, and fast. "They're trying to push me," she said. "Not with fists, with everything else." Marcus nodded again. He stepped forward, rested a hand on her shoulder. "You remember what I taught you. You don't swing first. You don't swing to win. You swing to end it." She didn't answer, just looked at her own reflection in the mirror across the room, for a long time. Then she said, "I'm not afraid of them." He smiled faintly. "I know you're not, but being brave doesn't mean you go looking for war. It means you stand your ground when war comes to you." Amara looked at him, her jaw set, her heart steady now. She nodded, not because she wanted to fight, but because she knew the time for silence was almost up, and when the next move came, she wouldn't run, she wouldn't fold. She'd finish it, not with rage, not with chaos, but with clarity and control. By the time Friday rolled around, the mood at East Ridge had shifted into something strange, something tense. The students could feel it, even if they couldn't explain it. Hallways were quieter. Conversations paused when certain names were mentioned, and more than once, eyes drifted toward Amara as she walked past, not in the way they used to, not with mockery, not even curiosity anymore. It was something closer to awe, mixed with expectation, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. And deep down, Amara knew they were right to. because it was waiting for her. She found it taped to her locker, perfectly centered, written in looping dramatic handwriting, just 3 lines, but loud enough to echo through the entire building. Behind the gym, after school, let's see what you've really got. Don't embarrass yourself by not showing up. There was no signature, but she didn't need one. The moment her eyes scanned the ink, she knew. It was Tessa. This was her style. Theatrical, public, desperate to reclaim a power she felt slipping through her fingers. And this wasn't some prank or note passed between classes. This was a challenge, a summons, a public declaration that only one of them would walk away with the upper hand. She read it once, then again, then folded it carefully like it was something precious and tucked it into her jacket pocket. Behind her, the hallway buzzed. No one spoke directly to her, but she could feel them all watching. She could feel the tension, thick in the air, pressing in from every direction. Whispers behind hands, quick glances, students nudging each other, eyes wide like they'd just seen something legendary unfold. Amara didn't react. She didn't speed up or slow down. She simply closed her locker, shouldered her bag, and walked to her next class. Calm, silent, focused. But inside her chest, her heartbeat was steady and loud. Not from fear, from clarity. This was the moment everything had been building toward. After school, the courtyard emptied faster than usual, as if everyone had something more important to do, somewhere else to be. But in reality, they were all gathering behind the gym. In groups of 3, 4, even more, they whispered and waited, each one pretending they were just hanging out. But the anticipation in their eyes said otherwise. Word had spread faster than wildfire. The new girl and the queen bee were going to face off, not online, not with rumors, in person, in real time, and no one wanted to miss it. Amara walked the path behind the gym like she was walking into a memory. Her steps were even, deliberate. She didn't pause, she didn't hesitate, but every move held weight, the kind that only someone who had trained for this kind of moment could carry. The field behind the gym was half covered in fading light, the sun slipping behind the trees, shadows growing longer. And at the center of it all stood Tessa, arms folded, flanked by Kylie and Paige on one side, and Mason and his always eager backup, Jax, on the other. Tessa looked exactly as expected, poised, polished, and armed with an icy smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. But when Amara approached, something shifted in her expression. For a split second, her smirk faltered. Maybe it was the calm in Amara's face. Maybe it was the lack of fear. Maybe it was the way the crowd instinctively parted to let her through. Whatever it was, Tessa's certainty cracked, even if just for a heartbeat. "You came," she said, as if that proved something. Her voice was loud, performative, made for the audience gathering behind her. Amara didn't respond. She stopped a few feet away, hands in her pockets, and stared at her with a quiet that felt like thunder rolling in the distance. Tessa took a step forward. "I thought maybe you'd run, like all the others." Amara tilted her head slightly. "You thought wrong." The words were quiet, but sharp, and everyone heard them. The crowd stilled, like the air had been sucked out of the space. Tessa's jaw tightened. She wasn't used to resistance. She was used to victory, quick, public, and absolute. This was supposed to be the final blow, the one that restored her place at the top, that reminded everyone exactly who ruled this school. But Amara's presence, her lack of fear, the way she stood so still, it was unraveling the script. Mason cracked his knuckles. Jax adjusted his stance, ready for a show. Kylie whispered something in Paige's ear, but no one moved. They were waiting. Everyone was waiting. And Tessa could feel the pressure closing in around her, so she did what she always did. She doubled down. "I hope you brought whatever fake confidence you've been hiding behind," she sneered, her voice rising. "Because after today, you're going to be nothing but another forgotten name, another girl who thought she mattered." Amara finally stepped forward. One step, just enough. Her eyes locked onto Tessa's like she was looking straight through her. and her voice, when she spoke, didn't rise, didn't waver. It cut through the tension like a blade. "You started this, not me, but if you're so desperate to end it, I'm ready." The weight of that moment dropped like a hammer. No one laughed, no one cheered. Even Tessa's group went quiet, because for the first time it was undeniable. The fear they were supposed to be inspiring was nowhere to be found. Not in Amara, not in her stance, not in her voice. Just calm, absolute calm, the kind that comes from knowing who you are and what you're capable of. Tessa blinked, and in that brief moment she realized she had no control over this anymore, not over the crowd, not over Amara, not even over herself, because despite everything, the planning, the manipulation, the threats, Amara wasn't breaking. She wasn't shrinking. She was standing tall, waiting, daring Tessa to make a move. And that's when it became clear. This wasn't Tessa's fight anymore. This wasn't her moment. It was Amara's. The crowd held its breath. The field behind the gym, once buzzing with anticipation and whispered bets, had gone completely silent. Students stood still, some frozen mid-laugh, others gripping the straps of their backpacks like something important was about to happen. And they weren't wrong. In that stillness, in the growing twilight of a Friday afternoon, Amara took one more step forward, the tension stretching tight like a bowstring between her and Tessa. But it wasn't Amara's body language that had the entire school holding its breath. It was her expression. There was no fear in her eyes, no hesitation, just a calm so powerful, it was unnerving. Tessa had come to this confrontation with every advantage, a crowd at her back, her entourage beside her, her reputation stacked like armor. She had expected fear, or at least defiance. What she hadn't expected was this: stillness. Amara didn't puff her chest or raise her voice. She didn't make threats or posture. She just stood there like someone who had already decided how the story would end. And the thing about people like Amara? They didn't bluff. Tessa shifted uncomfortably, her performance energy starting to waver. She opened her mouth to speak again, but before she could twist another insult out of her lips, Mason stepped forward. "You done talking?" he said, cracking his neck. "Because I think it's time she learns what happens when you mess with the wrong people." Tessa didn't stop him. Maybe she wanted to. Maybe deep down she felt the tremor in the ground before the earthquake. But her pride was louder than her instinct, and she stepped aside. Mason moved in fast, confident, casual, like he'd done this before. And maybe he had. Maybe he'd pushed people around so often that he thought he was unstoppable, but he didn't know who he was stepping to, and he definitely didn't know who had trained her. In a blur, he reached to shove Amara's shoulder, just a warning, just enough to shake her up, but she wasn't there. She slipped to the side, weight balanced, and in one seamless movement, she caught his wrist, twisted it, and flipped his momentum against him. The sound of Mason hitting the dirt was louder than anyone expected, louder than it should have been. He rolled over, groaning, not injured, but completely humiliated. The crowd gasped. Someone whispered, "Did you see that?" Another student actually dropped their phone, wide-eyed and stunned. Mason sat up, dazed, looking around like the world had just flipped upside down. Because it had. The golden boy, the strongest, tallest guy in school, had just been taken down by a girl half his size in less than 2 seconds, and she didn't even break a sweat. Jack stepped forward next, less confident than before, but still too prideful to back down. "Lucky shot," he muttered, then lunged. A straight, clumsy rush meant to intimidate, but Amara didn't flinch. She turned her body slightly, sidestepped at the last second, and let him stumble past her. Then, with calculated precision, she grabbed his shoulder and brought him to the ground with a sweep so smooth it looked like choreography. No punches, no fury, just clean, controlled technique. It was martial arts, but it was more than that. It was restraint and strength, the kind that doesn't need to prove itself, the kind that's always been there, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Jax groaned and crawled back, eyes wide with disbelief. He looked up at Amara, confused, not just by how fast he lost, but by how gently she'd done it. No gloating, no revenge, just discipline. And that's when the realization began to set in, not just for him, but for everyone watching. This wasn't about winning. Amara wasn't fighting to humiliate. She was ending something, definitively, quietly, permanently. The air was thick with shock. Paige clutched Kylie's arm. Tessa stared, mouth slightly open, trying to understand what had just happened. Her voice caught in her throat. Her legs stiffened. Every trick she'd ever used, the words, the laughter, the fear, none of it worked anymore. Not on this girl, not in this moment. For the first time, Tessa Blake didn't feel powerful. She felt small, smaller than she ever had in her life. Amara turned to her slowly. Her eyes didn't glare. They didn't burn with anger. They were cool, clear, and steady. And in that gaze, Tessa saw herself. Not as she'd always pretended to be, the leader, the ruler, the one in charge, but as she really was. A scared girl who had built her power on the fear of others. And now, faced with someone who didn't fear her at all, it all collapsed. She tried to recover, tried to salvage the last shred of control. "You think this makes you something special?" she said, her voice trembling under the pressure. "You think people are going to like you now, respect you? You're just a freak with a chip on her shoulder." But no one laughed. No one nodded along. In fact, the students behind Tessa had started stepping back. Even Kylie and Paige looked unsure, their loyalty fraying in real time. The crowd wasn't with her anymore. They weren't laughing at Amara. They weren't even looking at her. They were looking at Tessa, and for the first time, not with admiration, but with pity. Amara didn't need to say much, just one sentence, soft but final. "It's over." She didn't yell. She didn't fight again. She didn't raise her hands or demand anything. She turned, picked up her backpack from the ground, and walked away. Just like that. Leaving behind the girl who once ruled East Ridge, standing in silence, surrounded by classmates who no longer knew what to make of her. Amara didn't need applause. She didn't want a crown. All she wanted was peace. And now, finally, she had it. The following Monday, the atmosphere at school was different. It wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. It was just still. The kind of still that comes after a storm has passed. Amara walked through the halls the same way she always did, head up, quiet, calm. But the stares were different now. They weren't mocking. They weren't judgmental. They were respectful. Some students gave her nods. Others moved aside for her to pass. No one tried to talk to her, not yet. But the silence around her had changed. It was no longer the silence of rejection. It was the silence of recognition. And Tessa, she still came to school, still dressed well, still tried to hold herself like the old days. But something was broken now. The power was gone. The invisible leash she had wrapped around everyone had vanished. Her table in the cafeteria, once the most crowded and coveted, now had more empty seats than filled ones. Kylie and Paige sat elsewhere. Mason kept his distance. Jax didn't even look her way. And when Tessa walked down the hall, the same students who used to greet her with admiration now looked away, not because they hated her, but because they didn't care anymore. Amara saw her once, alone at a lunch table, picking at her food. No entourage, no crowd, just silence. And for a moment, Amara paused. Not out of cruelty, not to gloat, but because she understood something that no one else in that cafeteria could. She knew what it was like to be isolated, to feel like the world had moved on without you, to have your image shattered and your foundation gone. And in that brief, shared glance across the room, Tessa saw it too. Amara gave her a small nod, not of friendship, not of forgiveness, just understanding. And then she walked away. That was her power. Not just her strength, not just her discipline, but her ability to rise without stepping on anyone else, to win without needing the world to bow down. She didn't want a throne, she wanted freedom, and now she had both. East Ridge would never be the same, not because someone lost, but because someone stood, quietly, firmly, with nothing but control, principle, and quiet defiance. And somehow, in a school built on fear, that kind of strength was the loudest thing anyone had ever seen.